Hey everyone! So it's just on 9 o'clock here now, so we should kick off this live stream. And if you're joining here today, just please give a little shout out. Let me know where you're coming in from. And also, it'd be great to know as well. Do you currently use Excel? Do you currently use R? Or do you use both? That would be really helpful to get some feedback on this to, well, really try and make this more relevant for you. So, let's kick off and get going. Now, in today's session, I'm going to be comparing off Excel and R. So in the first part of this, we're going to be taking a bit of a look at, well, why use Excel? And we're also going to be talking about how Excel is actually much more than a spreadsheet now. Now, if you've seen some of my previous videos before comparing R to Excel, a lot of that is actually based on R versus Excel, the spreadsheet, right? And I wanted to do that comparison because that's the spreadsheet model of Excel is probably how 99% of people actually use Excel. Now, over the years, Excel has massively been extended through a whole bunch of different enhancements. And we're going to be reviewing some of those here today because, well, really, these extensions, sometimes Excel is effectively all you have to work with, or possibly it's all you know that there is to work with. And so I'm going to be giving a whole bunch of solutions that you can implement even in Excel, right? And so this is going to be going into a bit of the how to become an advanced Excel user, the typical path, as well as, probably what some of the, what my recommendation would be is if you wanted to actually become an advanced Excel user today. Then I'm going to be going over some things like, well, Excel's secretly developed power features, right? So these are the kind of things that allow you to actually deal with millions of records in Excel, like even though there's only a million rows, right? And how you can introduce a really important kind of data science concepts that you would find typically in a tool such as R, such as reproducibility. So I'm going to be discussing those as well, because to be honest, regardless of what tool that you use, there's certain concepts which are just really important. And a lot of times, particularly if you're coming from Excel, you're not often familiar with these concepts. So I'm going to be going over some of those. Where they're going to be going over into, well, what exactly is R? Because, everybody knows what Excel is. R, well, maybe not necessarily. And we're going to be going over what does R actually do better? And, well, why most R kind of looks difficult to people, right? And at what point is R actually easier to learn than Excel? Because actually, to be honest, there is a point where even though Excel has all of these great features, it actually comes to a point where it's more complicated to implement things in Excel than it is to actually implement it in a different tool such as R. Okay, let me just take a look, see who's coming in here. So we've got Freddie and Valclav from Prague and Mohammed. So, hey, thanks for joining and giving a shout out. And so these sections, I am recording these sessions here. So thanks for asking. But these are, I don't know if I always post all of the recordings of these all the time, just because these live sessions in a way are basically a way for me to kind of talk to people and discuss with people and just get some ideas out of my head. I've been working on this. I've been working on some of these slides for a little while now, and I kind of wanted to hash them out and get a little bit of feedback on them. And I kind of figured that this was a really important video to make, just because I've been producing a lot of videos. A lot of them are about R. And I've been interacting with a lot of people who are already R users. But, I think there's a huge opportunity as well for people who don't currently know about R, or who have maybe dived into my channel and seen some things which either look, I don't know, possibly too difficult or too advanced or whatever it is, to really get a better understanding of where to kind of how to use both of these tools, basically, right? Because I teach both, which leaves, and there's a ton of overlap between the two tools, which leaves the question, well, what exactly should you be using? Why should you be using different things, right? So that's what I hope to cover off and address in this video. Okay, and Ezekiel, hey, thanks for joining. Glad you liked the video, so really appreciate that comment there. Okay, so first up, why use Excel? Well, I mean, for a lot of you, this may seem completely obvious. To others of you, it might seem like, well, there's different feelings about Excel depending on where you sit and where you're coming from. But effectively, Excel has 750 million users, which means it's effectively everywhere, right? Any organization or company that you go into already has a copy of Excel. I mean, even though it's not free software, it's effectively free, right? Just because it's everywhere you go. The barriers to entry is very, very low to Excel. You can just kind of open up a file and just start working with it, right? So there's very low barrier to entry. There's a lot of stuff where, you don't even necessarily need to click develop formulas or anything like that. And there's a lot of stuff that you can just click and drag and stuff like that to do a whole ton of things. So that's a valuable feature right there. It is a highly developed tool. I mean, it's been around for over 30 years now. So there's certain things that Excel does really, really well. And for a lot of people, well, what else is there, right? So, which is part of what I hope to kind of inform you a little bit more about in this session today. And okay. And hello to Christian from Norway, mainly using R and only slightly Excel. Okay, great to have that feedback there too. So for those of you who are actually using more R currently than Excel, this might be a little bit insightful actually, because Excel has developed a lot, and even if you don't use Excel a lot yourself, you're probably finding that you have to work with a lot of data that comes from Excel, or users who use a lot of Excel. And by knowing a few more of the features that are kind of available, then it kind of makes it easier for everybody, and tries to, part of my lectures is try and get everybody onto the same kind of page and just clean up the data quality for everybody, because that just makes life easier. So, okay. Okay, so let's give a little bit of background behind Excel. Now, this is, again, Microsoft developed its first spreadsheet program back in 1979. So this was the spreadsheet. And if you look at this was a really, really long time ago. This was when computers really didn't have much capacity. They didn't have any storage. There was no such thing as big data or even medium-sized data. Things were held on tape drives, and there was just no capacity to store any information at all. And this is effectively the environment that the spreadsheet was invented in, right? So here's a copy of a screen here, and spreadsheets were were the first killer app for the PC, right? And effectively, they were a very, very advanced calculator, because you had these sheets where you could plug in numbers anywhere. And very easily do kind of multiple calculations kind of on the fly. Now, there are lots of cases where this kind of model is still actually very useful. Often, I'll pull out a copy of Excel to build some very, very simple models, or basically use it as an advanced calculator. Now, this is the spreadsheet model. We'll go over the different types of functionality that's been added to Excel since the spreadsheet, right? But fundamentally, when you open up Excel, it is a spreadsheet. Now, the limitations of the spreadsheet is that things go into cells And you type in formulas into cells, and effectively you type it into one cell, right? And so your values that come back from your formulas populate a single cell. And if you want that to populate multiple cells, you have to fill that down and copy your formula across multiple cells. Now, if you know exactly how many output cells there are, like, okay, let's say you're expecting 5 numbers back, and so you, write a formula and variations of that in 5 different cells. But if you don't know how big your result set is going to be, like, well, maybe it's going to return 5 elements, maybe it's going to return 10, then that's a situation where spreadsheets become very difficult to deal with, because they just don't deal with ranges that dynamically resize. Now, if you are an advanced user, you might have heard of things like the offset formula and dynamic name ranges and these kind of things. And they kind of work. I mean, I've definitely used these and stuff before in the past, but they really are a bit of a hack, right? Okay. And no, I'm not related to Andrew Ng, but that's quite a compliment, since Andrew Ng is quite a brilliant guy. Ng is actually a very common surname, if you believe it or not. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen this video that I put out on this 20-minute dashboard in Excel, right? So this is a 20-minute Excel dashboard, which involves 0 code and 0 formulas. And I just wanted to emphasize this bit, because the formulas in Excel are typically what actually slows it down, right? Now, it's kind of the unique aspect of the spreadsheet, but it's kind of what slows it down. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a sec, on how this actually works. But this model, right, if you've been through this tutorial before, actually bypasses the spreadsheet model, right? So that's something kind of interesting there that you may or may not have picked up on when you've done this video. Now, this video is on YouTube, but if you come to my website here, you've got that video as well as the files that go along with it as well. So you can download the data set as well as the finished dashboard, which you can basically copy and use for whatever you like. So anyway, if you wanted to follow along, you can go ahead and grab the files from there. Okay, so now let's take a little bit more of Excel's evolution since the spreadsheet. So as mentioned, Excel started with the spreadsheet, right? So this is the sheet-based model, which was back in 1979. It had interactive calculations, which is, really pretty fantastic. It was only able to deal with very small data. And even though it's able to deal with larger data now, the data, just because of the way that it's structured, the amount of data that it's able to handle compared to pretty much any other data analytics tool is highly constricted by this. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos on data structures, where I'm talking about cell-based models versus row-based models like you get in typical relational databases versus column store-based models, this is kind of what I'm talking about. So let me see. If you haven't seen that video already, it's this one here. So process data faster with any tool. So that at the end of this one here, it starts to talk about data structures. And so that is something that you can look into there as well. Okay. Now, after the sheet-based model, in 1993, Microsoft started to introduce a bunch of cool things. First of all, they introduced the pivot table, and they also introduced VBA. So first of all, with pivot tables. So pivot tables, they allowed you to reshape and summarize your data. And this was huge. This was a massive, massive improvement to spreadsheets, right? Now, and I've talked about how there are 5 different kind of table models actually in Excel. So sheets are one of them. I'd consider pivot tables another. They're almost like another data structure. I mean, they're summarizing your data that you have in sheets. But the thing that you have to realize about them is that they operate in a very different way. Like once you get your data into a pivot table, you can't really use regular Excel formulas in the pivot table anymore, right? They do have calculated columns, but they use their own syntax. If you want to get it back out into a sheet model again, you have to use get pivot data functions and that sort of thing. And it works, but it's not really kind of the best solution, right? Then you've got things like VBA, which gives you kind of programmatic control. So if you're trying to automate anything, when VBA came out, it was kind of quite revolutionary, really, because all of a sudden you didn't have to do stuff manually. You didn't have to repeat your manual processes all over and over and over again. Now, one of the things, if you've seen some of my videos in the past, is that the issue with VBA is effectively that it's not actually designed to work on the data. It's actually designed to operate on Excel, right? Or actually any Microsoft program for that matter. But you're talking about things like, okay, well, an Excel sheet is made up of sheets, like, so you've got different tabs, and it's also made up of cells and ranges. But your ranges have names like A1 and A2 and kind of fairly meaningless things like that. Like if you don't name your ranges, then you end up writing quite horrible code, right? Because what on earth does cell A1 mean when you're referencing your code? The other thing is that, as mentioned like previously, the way that sheets are fundamentally based is that you have single cells and, when they resize, when the data inside them resizes, it's relatively, there's all this overhead, all this additional code, all this additional logic just to tell how much the range has grown by. So there are hacks to do it, but it's not something that Excel does natively. So that's something really important to keep in mind there. And so VBA works, and I used to kind of use these solutions for a really long time. Like for a long time, this was my kind of go-to solution, right? Because here's the thing, right? You have IT, right, on one end, and then you have businesses on the other end, where the most advanced tool that you have available in the business is basically Excel. And if you got some VBA, then, maybe you can start to do some IT-ish kind of work, right? And why do people use Excel instead of, some other more advanced kind of programming language? Well, first of all, you're not IT. Secondly, IT projects take a really long time, right? So it's like you think, okay, well, this would really make sense to automate this. Why are we chucking all these resources and people to do these manual tasks, increasing the risk and all of these kind of things, when this would be like a really simple script or piece of code? Well, if you've ever gone to an IT department, it's, at least 6 weeks just to spec it. And then, maybe the project is another 6 months to 18 months to get done, right? Now, that's what IT projects are like within, sort of medium to large size organizations, right? So we go back to Excel, we go back to VBA because it's like, well, you know what? I could do that in an hour. So, it takes much less time just to write the whole thing than it is to, even put together the spec document for the IT guys to come along and say, no, let's not do that, right? But I'm hoping to kind of show you some better alternatives to VBA, because in this day and age, like 1993, VBA might have been a good solution, but now as it is today in 2018, I'd say do not use VBA. VBA is not something you want to use in 2018, right? Because there's much better solutions. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, in 2007, Excel introduced tables. And actually, let me pull up a copy of Excel just so that you actually know what I'm talking about. Okay. So here in Excel, you open up a file and this is what it typically looks like. And this is still using the sheet-based model, right? So you've got the cells here. And one of the good things, as well as the bad things about Excel, is that it's very flexible in terms of what you can put in, right? You can put anything anywhere pretty much, right? So it's not very strict about how the way that data is organized. Now, in 2007, they introduced this feature called the table. Now, if you don't know about this already, I can click on one of these cells here. I'm going to use the Control-T command, and this goes create table. I'm going to click OK, and now I've got this blue stripy table. So if you've seen this before, right, this is not just pretty formatting, and this is fundamentally a different data structure in Excel, which is way, way more powerful than just the sheet-based model. Right? Now you can still use sheet-based formulas, which is kind of nice. But now we actually have a data structure which actually cares about the, like the different columns, right? So, okay, this column is going to contain kind of one set of information here, right? It actually picks up that this is a numeric column, right? Okay. And thanks for the comment there about the new array formulas. So for those of you who don't know, that there are some new features as well, that dynamic array formulas as well, which do some cool things. But let me continue on through this. So the table-based model meant that if I added, say a new calculated column over here, or even if I didn't, let's say I wanted to refer to this table, I can refer to this by a name and then access all the columns from it. So I could take one of these fields here. I can use all of the code completion and maybe, put a function around that. And so as you can see here, this syntax is much, much nicer to work with, right? Okay, so that is the table feature within Excel. Now the thing is with this is that it's still, it's much better organized, which is important, but it's still based within the sheet. And one of the things with sheets is that if you have a formula, let's say I want to, concatenate a couple of columns here, right? Okay, this effectively has to make copies of it like all the way down, right? Okay. Okay. Let's go back to here. So anyway, that is tables there. Now, the next along the list, in 2010, they released Power Pivot, right? Now, Power Pivot, in a way, is quite similar to tables, but again, it is another separate data structure to tables as well. So Power Pivot allows for large data sets. So Power Pivot is what enables you to have millions of records dealt with in Excel. And interestingly enough, it actually saves the files much, much smaller than even your typical Excel files. As much as 40 times smaller than your typical Excel files, just by saving the data in Power Pivot, because it uses a special type of column level compression that makes your file smaller. So that's a neat little hack to make your Excel file smaller. You just offload the data into Power Pivot, make sure that it doesn't exist inside the sheets at all, including in tables, which still exist inside the sheets, and you make your file 40 times smaller, right? It also supports joins. So if you've ever used things like databases, you're familiar with joins. Now, you also know that if you've used databases, that joins are much better than using things like VLOOKUPs. VLOOKUPs are probably the number one formula that actually slows Excel down by quite a lot. So Power Pivot is one of the things that enables you to build joins and connect multiple tables together very, very quickly within seconds, just by dragging and dropping joins between tables. And lastly, over here, we have Power Query. Now, Power Query, I think, is one of the key things that I teach when I teach Excel. So a lot of people start with, Excel using sheets and formulas. And a lot of the lectures even today start with sheets and formulas, right? So one of the things that I start with is actually Power Query. Right? And why is that? Why do I start with Power Query as opposed to actually teaching anything else? So Power Query is nice because it's the first point into your application. Now, Power Pivot you may or may not use. Like if you're not dealing with bigger data, then you might just use tables because tables are actually more familiar. And these two kind of do the same thing. They don't exactly do the same things, but they kind of do the same thing, right? Now, so I've got down here, you can transform and load your data. It's got batch processing and reproducibility. Now, I mentioned before that reproducibility was a really important concept when you're getting into things like data analytics, data science, those kind of things. And what does that mean exactly, right? So whenever we produce a piece of work, we want to make sure that if we're given like a new data set or just even re-given the same data set, and we need to understand what steps took place in order to get to your final result, right? That's what Power Query does for you. And, if you're using things like R and different things like that, then, that's kind of automatically what you do anyway, right? But with spreadsheets, that's been much more, with Excel, that's been much more difficult because if you wanted to record any processes in the past, then you would have need to have done it through VBA. And as mentioned, the reason why you don't want to use VBA because it's incredibly inefficient at accessing the data model within Excel. It's used for accessing basically elements of the spreadsheet, not elements of your data. And this is a big deal, right? Now, this is, so Power Query allows you to access components of your data. Now, again, it allows you to do this by basically just clicking buttons, right? And so if I pull up a blank spreadsheet again, if I go to data, get data, and, I could grab any type of file format here. Right. Okay, and so if I click on transform data, then you've got all of these options here, right? So you can see here, you can select columns, remove columns, keep rows, remove rows. You've got all these transformations, like being able to transpose data. You can select different data types, all right? So the different data types here, split columns, add calculated columns, and a whole bunch of different things. So very, very powerful. So today, if you have a data preparation process, then Power Query just does this better than anything else in Excel, basically. And even some of the things like your joins and everything like that, you don't necessarily need to do them in Power Pivot because you can actually just do them in Power Query up front. So if you're going between the two of them, and if I was going to only teach you one, then I'd only teach you Power Query because you do it at the beginning of your process. Now the only thing is that when you are doing joins on tables, especially bigger tables, your data can get really large, like pretty big, pretty quickly. Now, if you're in that situation, then it may make more sense to do the join inside Power Pivot instead of Power Query, right? But anyway, there you go. Okay. So actually, just a few more points on this. There's the other thing about Power Query is that it separates the data processing from the actual data, right? So here's the thing that's kind of different. If you have your data and all your formulas and logic and everything like that in the same file, usually the data is going to change like every month, right? And a lot of times the formulas and business logic and everything changes as well. Now, if you have both of those kind of linked together, then when you want to refresh your data next month, then you're like chopping out your data and like reloading it again, right? And you have to make sure that the ranges match the same size. You're going through all these manual processes, just really not nice kind of things to do. Now, if you disconnect your data from your business logic, then it suddenly becomes a lot more robust and a lot cleaner. Like every month, you can basically say, take this business logic and apply it to the new data set, run, and you can just go. Now, if you need to do this for historic stuff, like let's say you need to retrospectively change the data sets because you came up with like some new reporting standard or something like that, then you can basically take your version of this business logic, which is separate from the data, and take that and apply it back to old data and stuff as well, right? So it kind of works both ways. But separating those two things out is really important, especially if the data is changing like quite frequently. If your data and business logic are not separate, somebody implements a new change to the data and it's out of sync with your formulas or something like that, you might end up losing your business logic changes, or you might end up losing some data or whatever it is, right? So that's why it's really important to separate the two. Now, again, in R, this is something that you just kind of do automatically, but until the introduction of Power Query, it's not something that you kind of really did. And now with Power Query, that can just become like an automatic thing that you always do anyway. Now, it's not something I've emphasized massively when actually teaching the lecture on Power Query, but it is actually one of the most, it's actually one of the most valuable aspects of Power Query. So anyway, there you go. Something that you may be doing that you didn't even realize you were already doing. Okay, so traditional Excel workflow is, this is actually a fairly old workflow now, right? Because as mentioned, sheets and pivot tables, these were, pivot tables were introduced back in 1993, so quite a while back now. But it's very, very typical that, let me just come up with a little example here. Well, anyway, basically it's very typical that you get a worksheet, you run a pivot table off of it, and then what people would used to do, or maybe still do now, right, although not recommended, is that they would use the get pivot data function. Now, I don't know if anybody here does that, but when you use the get pivot data functions to get the data out of a pivot table, it goes back into a static format again, right? So pivot tables were nice because you had this dynamic range, right? If you added new data to the sheet, well, this is actually part of the problem as well. If you do ever run a pivot table, do not run it off a worksheet. Run it at the very least off a table, because a table is a dynamic range, right? But a worksheet is not, right? So if you add new records to the end of your data set, if you refresh your data set, the pivot table is still, if it was anchored to row, I don't know, for argument's sake, row 5000, and now you've got row 5001, that does not work if in the sheet model, but it does if you're using tables, right? So there's the issue with the dynamic range there. Now, on the flip side, and now what people used to do is they basically said, okay, well, to get around that, I'm just going to select going to select the entire columns. Now, the reason why that's a really bad idea to do is for a couple of reasons. One, people often add the totals at the bottom of the data set, and that would end up doubling your numbers, right? So you've got a summary in a pivot table, and now your numbers have doubled, right? So that's a really bad idea to do. The other thing is that if you're the blank rows below your data set, because you selected the entire column, are effectively counted as blank cells, and they disable you from being able to do certain summarizations. Like for instance, if you're, a lot of people don't know that you can group by date. I wonder if I have got a data set here actually, but a lot of people don't know you could say do a group by date. So date, there is actually built-in date logic in Excel, which will collapse a regular date into a month or a week or a year. And you can get all those components and summarize that in a pivot table, which is really nice. But if you select the entire column, what happens is it gets counted as blanks, and then you lose the ability to do that, right? So something to keep in mind there. Okay. Now, when you go from a sheet to a pivot table back to a sheet again, this dynamic range, say you had, you're organizing by, say, 4 categories, right? So you got 4 categories, and now all of a sudden you have a 5th category. Well, because you pulled the data from your pivot table into your sheet, effectively using 4 formulas or 4 rows of formulas, when you get your 5th item, your get pivot data functions are out of date, right? They do not resize. So do not use this approach for creating reports, okay? It's not a good idea. Okay. So here we are again looking at the 5 different types of tables in Excel. So here we have Power Query at the very start, right? Power Query then loads the data. Remember, Power Query separates the business logic from your original source data, right? But it doesn't hold any data in it itself, right? Now, to hold data inside of Excel, it's got to exist in either, well, a sheet, right, or a table, a pivot, Power Pivot, or actually, you can actually bypass these altogether and load it directly into pivot table as well, right? A little hack there, right? Now, typically what I do, so in the courses I teach loading from Power Query to tables and then running pivot tables off of that, right? And the reason for that is that people often like to see the records, people like to see the line by line data to review it, to analyze it, and different things. And really the easiest way to do that is within tables. Now, again, Power Pivot will allow you to do the same thing as well, but let me just see if I can pull this up here. Okay. Power Pivot exists in a different section, right? So the data doesn't exist in the worksheets at all. It exists within the Power Pivot data model, right? Where is that going off to? Oh, it's a little slow. Okay, it exists inside of here, which is again like a different way of working with your data. So it does allow for much larger data sets. It does allow for some cool things, but it's an additional thing you need to learn, right? Okay. And then so you can go from pivot tables, and here I've got sticking into sheets, but to be honest, actually I would probably cross out sheets there, and I would go from pivot tables directly into pivot charts, right? So I'd either stick data directly into pivot tables or pivot charts, basically because those dynamically resize with your data, right? So anyway, this right here is how you can get Excel to work with larger data. Automatically refresh and get automated without any VBA whatsoever. And, as mentioned in, in my exercise, I got this dashboard, and, this, like all of these, this took about 20 minutes to put this whole thing together. So you can do some pretty powerful stuff. I had a comment the other day that, Tableau's better, right? And that's kind of true. But, Tableau's cost like $1,000 to $2,000 or something like that for a license to get, whereas Excel's automatically already everywhere, right? So that's an important thing to take into consideration as well. It's not only that, it's besides that's the license cost for just one computer, right? And usually if you put a piece of work together, you actually want to share it with people. You actually want to give it to people. And there's additional license costs for that as well, right? Now, if you're already using some of these tools and everything like that, Tableau was great when it came out, nearly 10 years ago or something. And it was a revolutionary product at the time. Now, since then, in the last few years, basically everybody's copied Tableau. So, Microsoft has got Power BI. ClickView basically recreated themselves, and because ClickView was it's kind of an older version of Tableau, but it wasn't self-service. It was made for developers. So they reinvented ClickSense, right? Which is again copy of Tableau, and Amazon came out with Amazon QuickSight, or AWS QuickSight, which is great because it cut the cost by 10 times, right? So it's much cheaper. Now even since the price competition from AWS, Power BI and ClickSense also cut their prices to match AWS, which is fantastic, which is really great. You can even get free versions for like single user use, but there's a cost when you go to actually deploying it. So if you want to have it for more than one user, then it starts to cost money, right? Which is definitely something to keep in mind. But now these days, I would say, if you're going to pick up a data visualization tool, Tableau is still the most popular, right? But I've seen the reports from like large companies, and they're basically phasing out Tableau because, the other companies have caught up. They've done, even though not everything is better, but there's certain things that are better. Like every other product includes a data modeler, which Tableau doesn't, right? And the license cost is, at least 5 times cheaper, right? So, just something to keep in mind there. Tableau is actually being phased out, even though it's still the most popular tool right now, right? So something to keep in mind there. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the kind of learning curve for Excel. So here we have learning curve, and down the bottom we have capability. So things like pivot tables are, like really easy to learn, right? Just click, drag, and everything. Power Query, again, is also very easy to learn. There's no formulas. You just find the button that you need to use to transform your data. I'd say it's slightly more technical than pivot tables, just because you need to get the concept of transforming data. But this is really good skills to have, right? Because once you know how to transform data, then that's a really, really big piece of data analytics work, is just transforming the data. And that's what Power Query does all for you with a few button clicks. Then you got Excel formulas. Again, like I probably use Excel formulas 100 times less than anybody else does, right? But I still use them, like occasionally. I just use them very little, right? So if you've done kind of my Excel course or anything like that, then there's a section on interactive modeling, which uses Excel formulas, right? So there is definitely a place for them, just not as much as people think, right? So something to keep in mind there, right? Any operation that you're doing on a lot of cells, you should really be using, basically any one of the other kind of models inside of Excel that I talked about earlier. You shouldn't be using formulas if it is spread across a lot of cells, is kind of the gist of it. Right. So going up kind of the ladder, you've got things like DAX. Now, again, DAX is another formula language, right? Separate from regular Excel formulas, is another formula language. which enables you, it unlocks the power of Power Pivot, right? So again, as I mentioned, Power Pivot is what you use if you want to work with bigger data inside of Excel. But again, the problem with it is that it uses a different place. The data between like all of these different stages is all separate as well. So there's something to keep in mind there. You've got things like array formulas now. Array formulas, I think, these are actually work in standard Excel sheets. Array formulas were probably some of the kind of hacks that you used to use like 10 years back. And they're pretty powerful, but they're really not that intuitive. They're not very elegant. They're hard to read. So, I just don't think they're the greatest to work with. And then you've got things like VBA, and I've already kind of gone on about VBA enough, but it's really not that easy a language to use. It's very, very verbose and not efficient for automation at all. Okay, so I would say this is kind of the rough learning curve for Excel. And the trouble is that even though you can do everything in Excel, you need to transfer your data between, Power Query is great, but then you need to transfer it into, say, a table, right? Or where you use formulas, or Power Pivot where you use DAX, right? And then you take that out and stick it into a pivot table, which uses, a different thing again. So, across all of these processes, you're actually doing pretty similar kind of things. What do you want to do with data anyway? You want to add or remove columns. You want to join it. You want to connect it to other data sets is a lot of times, like what you do with VLOOKUPs or whatever. You are, where would I get up to? Adding calculated columns. Grouping, summarizing, like the kind of things that you do in pivot tables all the time. These are the kind of things that you're always wanting to do with your data, whatever kind of stage you're at. And here's the funny thing, right? Each of these actually does all of those, right? So, there is this kind of confusion about, which stage of the process do you actually do it at? It's like, if you do more summarization, filtering, and aggregation at the Power Query stage, then your data set's not so big, and so it's easier for Excel to handle it, right? But then again, if you put it into Power Pivot, then you're not necessarily so worried about how big the data is. So you're not worried about as much about capacity, right? But just lots of different little things to think about there, right? Now, this is where I kind of think that kind of R comes in, and I think it actually becomes easier at around about this point, right? Because all of these different processes that I mentioned, right? Grouping, summarizing, filtering, and reshaping your data. It's a single set of functions in R, and it works across like every phase, right, of the operations, right? So, if you want to pivot data, it's the same thing. It's the same thing as when you're loading the data. You don't need to stick the data especially into Power Pivot to get to be able to handle large data, because R just does that automatically. So in fact, I think it actually deals with it better than Power Pivot, right? So, once you're getting up to these stages, then, I think that, R actually becomes kind of actually easier and faster to learn. Personally, I don't think it's really too much more difficult than Excel formulas, so that's somewhat debatable just because everybody's already familiar with Excel formulas. But it does a lot of things much more elegantly. So the strategy that I would employ, right, is something effectively like this, right? If you're starting out with Excel and you're not really familiar with code or anything like that, then I would be starting off with things like Power Query and pivot tables, because they're very easy to get into. You can start to learn important principles like separating your data from your business logic. Things like reproducible research, because Power Query saves all of the steps, right? And how this is actually also doing all of the automation for you, right? So no need VBA anymore because it's all automated in Power Query, right? And so this is a very kind of nice workflow. And I think this is, really pretty accessible to anybody, right? So, even your secretary or someone like that, like an admin or anybody who's kind of opening up and working with data, kind of, not so often, then you can kind of get the hang of these, right? You just pretty much just need to know that it's there, right? So that makes a very nice entrance into here. Now, when getting into more complex things, right? Like once you're getting up to this other end of the scale, just switch over to R. It's gonna be easier. Now, I fully appreciate that a lot of times you're in an organization and you don't have any control over what software is installed, right? And this is part of the problem. You just kind of get given what you're given, right? And a lot of times it's like, okay, well, I have Excel, and R, by the way, is free, right? So it's not like R costs any money to install. So you probably want to, at least you're not having to make any budget requests for it. So you could just request it, maybe, or if you have the ability to, just download it and install it. And then you have this extremely powerful tool that you can use to do a lot of things. Now, it's all nice to kind of just talk about it. Let me try and just show you a few things, right? So, okay. So, I created a video on this the other day, but here's a very quick R dashboard, right? And so I created a video on basically how you kind of set this up in 10 seconds by using a template. And again, this is one of the benefits of, when you do switch over to something like code, it's much easier to reuse your work, right? This basically works with any data set, right? Just reload your new data set in. And I don't know if you guys seen the video that I put out, but it was basically a video on this, how I loaded, it's like several different data sets, including a data set including 5 million records, right? So anyway, I'm not going to go over that too much now because you can go ahead and check out that video. That'll be, one of these two here. So the 10-second dashboard, and then there's the 5 million record instant dashboard, kind of showing a few extra neat little things there. Now, R can be a little bit intimidating to start with because it's like, well, where do you start? Where is your data? It's just this kind of big block of code, right? And, it doesn't help as well that, so R was originally a programming language designed to teach statistics, right? And so if you're not really that familiar with statistics, then you're watching lectures where you've got two things to learn, right? You got to learn statistics and you've got to learn this programming language in this, you're basically being taught in a way that is usually often not that up to date either, right? So if you've seen some of my other videos, you'll know that I work with the tidyverse methodology of R, and this is, which makes it a lot better to work with bigger data sets. Because again, R is relatively old as well, like it was developed about 20 years ago. And so, loading up the data sets, a standard data frame in R, when you print it out, it will just try and print the entire data set because, data sets didn't used to be that big, right? So it just prints out the entire data set. And it's a little thing, but if you use the new methodologies like tidyverse, it usually generally load faster. It also only prints out like the top few records to start with, so that you don't accidentally end up just printing all of the data to your console for the next 10 minutes or something, right? Okay, but let me try and show you a few cool things that might be interesting. Now, one of the other videos I created in the past was a video on, here we go. So this video here, I don't know if that many people have really watched this one, but there's actually a ton of free videos on the channel here. Like this one here, I won't play this now, but this is combining a whole folder of files by using Power Query, right? So you can go in there and load up a folder of files. Now, if you go through that video, it's only 5 minutes or so. It'll show you some of the limitations of Power Query for loading up files as well. Let's see if we can do this in R, right? So let me see. Let's grab that folder there. Okay, so here, and actually, let me get rid of that window. Just sorry, that's not that folder. What do I call this folder? Okay, so I got this folder over here. Files to merge. Okay, so I've got these 7 files, right? So let's look that up. Files to merge. Right, so when I run that, I can see a list of all the different files I have here, right? If I want to get the full path, let's get full names is equal to true. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to merge all of these. I'm going to grab all these files and merge them into a single file, right? Something that is a pretty handy thing to be able to do, right? Something that people often like to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, for each of these files, I'm going to add these to a single data frame and using the function read CSV, right? So this is just a function used to load data. So I've got this one line of code here, press enter, and it's just loaded these 7 files for me. So if I review that, right, we can see all the data there, right? Now, if I want to view this in a more familiar kind of table format, then I still have this, right? And you can see all the data, just like you would kind of see in Excel. Now, if you've seen the lecture of me doing this in Power Query, you know that this hire date column, this is a little thing that I added to the files. Well, I only added this to the last file, right? And I wanted to basically demonstrate what happens when your data changes, right? So a lot of times you have these files that get sent out and then people do things to them, right? So the data changes format, like people decide to insert a column, add it, like remove a column, all these kind of things, which kind of really messes things up. Now, R actually deals with this in a much kind of nicer way. So in Power Query, you just lose the hire date column altogether, right? And it doesn't really warn you about it either, which is a bit of a pain, because the first file that gets imported, right, and if the first file has less columns, basically creates the column specification for the rest of the, for the rest of the files. Whereas this, if you have hire date, which isn't added to the last one, it just kind of adds it on, right? So you'll see down the bottom here, then we start to have dates here. Okay. Okay. Oops, did I get rid of that? Okay. Okay, so some other kind of neat things that you can do with this as well. Let's say that you want to... now, the other thing that makes it hard to put a whole bunch of files together is that you don't, let's say you sent out something and say you send out 100 files and you want to get them all back and stick them all back together. Well, somebody's messed up one of your files and now you don't know which one it is, right? So you've written, you're trying to glue them back together and you don't know which file's actually been messed up. Now, okay. This here, these 2 letters DF is for data frame, automatically combines all of these into a single data frame. But what you can actually do instead is you could put these, you could basically just import all of these tables and actually effectively have them as separate tables, right? So if I just get rid of that there and do the same thing, now this has effectively imported all of these tables into a list called DT, right? Okay, so right now this is printing out each of the separate tables. So you can very, very quickly go into each one of these and kind of investigate it. Now let's see if I can do something here to make this like a little bit more clear. So let's say I'm looking at DT and I want to do something like, I want to extract all the columns out of each of these. So I would just go map names, right? Now that's just printed me out the column names for all of these tables, right? So I can see here that, okay, well, all of these look pretty much the same. In fact, maybe this is still a little bit hard to see. I mean, I can kind of see that the higher date column is added on the end there. But, let's say I wanted to do something like find a count of these instead. Then, maybe I could do length. Okay. Right, and that just shows me how many columns each table has, right? And you can kind of do all kinds of things with this actually, right? So, what if I wanted the summary statistics for every single one of these tables? Well, I just go map summary, right? Now this is just giving me the summary statistics for every single table, right? So let's just stop for a second just to look at some of the questions that we got here. So we got some great comments from Exact Pro BI. So Pivot function is good at preparing MIS reports. Okay. So I can see you're being forced to use Google Sheets for a few things. Now, that's an interesting one actually. So, I mean, Microsoft Excel is much more developed in Google Sheets. Like Google Sheets is, I would say, probably not a great analytics tool, but here's one thing that Google Sheets actually does better than Excel, in my opinion, anyway. So we've just been talking about data collection, right? And I've just been going over these examples of how it's like, well, when you're an organization, you send out all these files for like data collection, you say, send it to all these people, and they come back and they stuff up your data. So then you have to go through all these processes to find out where the errors are and clean them up, right? Now, yeah, so R can actually deal with these like actually relatively nicely. And, being able to look at and analyze, like dozens, even hundreds, thousands of tables, like all at once, all at the same time, right? Through very concise code, right? So let me clear those out. Just functions like that, you can do very, very powerful operations. Instead of doing it once, you're doing it thousands of times. But, ideally, you don't want to have to do that at all, because really that kind of work is a bit of a pain. It's a lot of work to be able to still like look through all of these different files. Ideally, what you want to do is everything to come back in a clean format in the first place. You want people to not mess up your files, right? Now, even though Excel has things like data validation and everything like that, it's not particularly great, because data validation in Excel is very easy to override, right? Now, I don't know, for anybody who still wants to do this, I have a few kind of little tips and hacks and stuff as well, by basically setting up tables first and selecting the column ranges before you add data validation. Which makes the data validations automatically expand, right? But still, regardless of all of that, it's not very robust, right? It's way too easy to override any kind of data validation in Excel. Now, in my opinion, what are the kind of two best kind of solutions for this? Well, one of them is actually using Google Sheets, right? Because Google Sheets are centralized, right? They are centralized on a server. Sharing is something which is kind of natively built into Google Sheets, and you have Google Forms on top of them, right? And there's nothing extra to implement a Google form, right? You just drag a few fields on and it like imports to a Google Sheet. Now the data validation in a Google form, right, is much better than anything that you could kind of manually do in something like Excel, right? So there's one benefit, even if it's not necessarily for kind of data analytics, but it is much, much better for data collection. Now, if you don't have the option to use Google Sheets and you're using a Microsoft Stack, then the kind of best option from Microsoft, in my opinion, is to use something called a SharePoint list. Okay. Now, this is actually very different from just uploading a Excel file to a SharePoint, right? Because uploading a Excel file to a SharePoint, there's still a lot of locking issues, right? It just, I don't know, I've just never found it to work very well, right? You got to check in, check out the files. It's not made for lots of people to do data entry. And then you're still stuck with all the data validation issues and everything like that you do, that you do with Excel. So if you use a SharePoint list, it's almost like having a mini database, right? All the records are timestamped. You get multiple users like inputting. You've got version control, everything in there, right? So using a SharePoint list for organizations is a much, much better solution than using distributed Excel spreadsheets, right? So anyway, just a little extra tip for you there. Okay, now I had this other question here as well, on what your thoughts on ClickSense. So for a while, I kind of thought, oh yeah, ClickSense, they made ClickView, which was a pretty good product. But again, ClickView was only for developers, and ClickSense is a much newer product, right? I think it's a pretty good product, but again, this space is becoming very commoditized, right? In my opinion, there's not a lot of difference between any of the visualization tools, right? So regardless of which one you pick, it doesn't really matter too much. But which one would I pick? Well, okay. So ClickSense, it only has its BI solution. And for existing ClickView customers, it kind of still uses the existing ClickView data model, right? So it can make a nice upgrade, I suppose, for ClickView customers. But again, it's also so different as well that I don't know how much of it is necessarily kind of reusable. Because it has a data model, that is one of the benefits of Tableau, on top of the fact that it's probably about 5 times cheaper. So I'd say ClickSense and Power BI are probably the two closest matches together. When AWS QuickSight came out, I was very excited about the product because, this was basically Amazon building something, and everything they build is kind of massively scalable and, instantly deployable and everything like that. So I was very excited about that. But the problem with QuickSight is that it's really only web-based right now, and it ties you into Amazon, right? And that's one of the kind of downsides on it, because there's so many different cloud providers and service providers now. You may not necessarily want to go for a pure Amazon solution. Now, if you want to kind of decouple yourself from a sort of cloud-based or fixed-based solution, then Power BI and ClickSense are they both have data models. They're both kind of separate from any particular solution. They both have free kind of downloads. So, just get in and start playing with some of them. But between the two, ClickSense and Power BI, I'd go for Power BI, right? Now, here's the reason why, right? Between Tableau right now is, like I mentioned, is still the number one data visualization tool, but that's that's really because they had a 10-year head start, is what it is when it comes down to it. Power BI is number 2, right? Power BI will work with any technology stack, right? But it's also very well integrated with the Microsoft technology stack, which is a very common technology stack to use. And again, right, I've been teaching Power Query inside of, for Excel, right? And everybody has Excel, so everybody can get started with Power Query. Now, Power BI uses Power Query as the data modeler, right? So, you can prep, it's all very familiar, right? I have Power BI here. Let me see if I can open it up. And you can see that the transforming your data is basically Power Query. So if you learn one, you've learned both, right? And that's the other extra benefit that I haven't really mentioned before of Power Query, is that it works with Excel and Power BI, right? Okay, let me pull something up. Okay, look familiar? Okay, this is my screen's getting a little funny here. But anyway, this is yeah. This is your query editor inside of Power BI. And as you can see, it looks just like Power Query. It pretty much is, right? So a nice little benefit there. Okay. Microsoft is just a much bigger player than Qlik, right? And, who knows, maybe Qlik has some marginal little extra feature which is really nice or something like that. Maybe Tableau does as well. I know Tableau has some neat little things, like they are Tableau has kind of gotten to this point where they've gained this massive market share, and they are investing heavily to kind of reinvent themselves in a way and add new features and functionality. Like if you've seen some of my other lectures, I've talked about things like graph network analysis, right? As far as I'm aware, Tableau is still the only one of the visualization tools that handles graph network analysis. But, would I buy Tableau for that? Unfortunately, probably not, right? Because I'd just do that in R or something instead. So, and I don't know, I'm sure somebody will come up with some feature that, someone will always come up with some sort of feature that some particular tool does really, really well. But it's just a question of if it's really worth it, right? So let me see. So you can pull up Google Trends here, right? And can stick in, say, Tableau. Compared to Power BI. Compared to, let's just say, Qlik. Okay. So you can see here that, Tableau definitely has the majority market share. Power BI second, and Qlik is, kind of really a fair bit lower. So, if I was picking a technology, if I was, I don't really like to go with just the technologies which are the most used or the most popular, because sometimes to use a tool just because it's the most popular is not really kind of the best reason for me. Obviously, it has to have enough volume to make sense. to use, but you kind of have to look at the whole thing as well. This is something as well. Like I got this comment on one of my videos the other day when I was comparing R and Python, and somebody came along and said, well, Julia is even better, right? And it's like, okay, well, yeah, possibly, but like, there's just not enough of a user base there. There's just not enough of a community there to really progress and develop the language, right? So, between R and Python actually has a lot more users because, it's used for so many different things, but R still has 2 million users, which is, like a small country, right? So there's plenty of users, plenty of support, plenty of development going on in that space, right? And there's just certain things that I kind of, there's benefits to both languages, but there's definitely things in R that for data analytics that just work really, really well that I haven't seen port over to Python yet. Now, everything's coming together like so quickly, like there's so much development in all the space that, all of the products kind of fuse together anyway, eventually, right? But anyway, there you go. Okay. So, now I hope that kind of answers your question there. It's a bit of a long answer. What I hope that you get out of this this whole live stream. If you are basically the reason why I really wanted to do this is just because I was basically an advanced Excel user for many years, right? And like I said, Excel was my go-to solution for a lot of times because I didn't work in an IT department, right? And if you're not in an IT department, it was the only tool available, or so I thought. We're now getting to the stage where that's becoming no longer the case. Now, R and Python, you might not necessarily see it around. Now, if you do, jump on it, right? Jump on the opportunity to get involved in these things because they will give you so much more capability and power. It will just completely change your life as an analyst, right? Working with things like Excel, you'll never be able to do like solid automations. You'll never be able to get into any of the kind of machine learning, data science-y kind of stuff, right? You really need to start switching up your tools to be able to do that. And when I say never, who knows? Like maybe Excel will build out something where you're able to do that. But the thing is that Excel just has so many layers now, and hats off to Microsoft for building in all of this functionality. But it's really gotten to the stage where it's really actually much more complicated than it is simple to implement these advanced features. And if I had known that some of these other tools existed, and like right now I teach a lot of R. I think it's if you don't know any programming currently, if you're not already working with something like Python, then I think R is like an easier transition, and it deals with certain things. Like it's much easier to build dashboards in R than it is Python, right? Different things like that, right? But be open to some of these new tools. Know that they're there. I wish I did, and this is kind of what this video is really all about. So. Anyways, I am going to leave it there. If you have any other questions, leave a comment, let me know. More than happy to answer anything. I hope that this session has been informative and helpful and given you some new insights to, how you can develop out your skills and different things like that. And I will see you next time.